Lecture number 9 for Western Civ 1. The late Roman roots of Western civilization. In the time of the Roman Empire, Rome had grown to the point where they could rightfully claim the Mediterranean as Mare Nostrum, our sea. They ruled the world that they knew. They knew something of places far beyond, and we find that their coins went as far east as places like Cambodia, for example. But they felt fairly safe and secure through the period of the 2nd century up until the time of Marcus Aurelius. But even during that time, things were shaken as there were diseases that plagued the empire at various times. But the Pax Romana is generally measured as coming to an end in the time of Marcus Aurelius. They'd enjoyed peace and tranquility. But as we begin today, I'd like to think about peace and tranquility in this world. In a fallen world, that's something that's rather unusual. Selfish people are often at odds with each other, and countries are rivals for resources, and oftentimes believe that they can't get something without having taken it away from somebody else. And we're not surprised that there would be ongoing conflicts in the midst of the Roman Empire, as there's various people that would confront that empire and various circumstances they'd face. This is in fact something that should be anticipated in a fallen world. And as we think about Jesus' discussions about time and what would come ahead, his disciples, as he came during his last week of his ministry to Jerusalem, they talked with him privately on the Mount of Olives in Matthew chapter 24, verse 3, and they asked him, when will this happen? Namely, his words about the destruction of the temple, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? So they ask a group of questions here. And Jesus tells them, watch out that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name claiming, I am the Christ, and will deceive many. You will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but see to it that you are not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise up against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of birth pains. What we saw back in Daniel chapter 2 and Daniel chapter 7 was that there was coming to be a great kingdom, a fearsome kingdom, the Roman Empire. But the Roman Empire was flawed in that it was divided. And what we're going to see is the Roman Empire is divided culturally to some degree, east and west, and there'll be conflicts amongst the successor states that take over as Rome collapses. One of its successors, however, in the east will last for a very, very long time, for another 1,000 years, in the capital city of Constantinople. But as we move today, we want to think about life in this world and the fact that things haven't changed too much. There continues to be troubles, but this is what should be expected in a fallen world. As we look towards the future, however, we look towards rest with God, in perfect relationship with Him and with each other. This is made possible through Jesus Christ. So as we go back to thinking then about the late Roman period and its contribution to Western civilization, what we find is that the relative tranquility of the Pax Romana was shattered by war cries and shrieks of anguish beginning in the 3rd century. The economy and social institutions of Rome faced collapse. The situation was faced not just by people in the cities, but also in the rural countryside of the Roman Empire. Rome had survived civil wars, insurrections, invasions, and plague, but what we're going to find is that it was weakened. During the same time, when Rome is feeling like it's falling apart, Christianity spreads widely and would be sufficiently rooted to survive great hostility of pagans who blame them for all the troubles, for the disruption of the Pax Deorum. The gods must be unhappy. They're not being worshipped properly, and so they're bringing hardship upon us. Oh, it's the Christians who are to blame. As we left off, we talked about the good emperors. But as we follow the good emperors, what we find is there's increasing struggle for succession. who's going to control the Roman Empire. The leadership crisis was one that I identified as beginning with Commodus. For a while there's a respite during the rule of the Severide dynasty, and the Severides had their challenges, and they would seek to cause people to have a greater sense of identity with the Roman Empire. And so in the time of Caracalla, he would extend civitas to everybody who lived within the Roman Empire for a fee. And so everybody could become a Roman citizen if they lived within the empire. His thought was that he would have armies that would be loyal and more people who would be engaged. In the years that followed, however, as they were ruled by the Barracks emperors from the year AD 235 until the year 285, we have a sequence of some 26 emperors over a 50-year period. This would be a real challenge, as there's a number of civil wars that are fought, and Romans are killing Romans, making them more vulnerable to outside attacks. But there's also other problems that are underway. There's continuing health issues, as plagues would diminish the population and result in sometimes tombs just being filled with bodies. They had so many they didn't know what to do with them all. But there's also economic crisis. An economic crisis that comes about in part because they're expending so much time and effort in wars. But as they become weakened, there's disruption of trade that war causes, and there's the desire on the parts of governments for increased taxes to pay for the soldiers that are fighting. And the result is that they don't have money to maintain infrastructure, and infrastructure like water channels and sewers and these sorts of things would oftentimes be neglected. In order to come up with money, they use the strategy of debasing their coinage, namely reducing the amount of silver in coins. Now there's a fixed rate that they had between gold coins and silver coins and bronze coins. The problem comes when your silver coins are largely made up of bronze or lead or some other cheap metal with very, very little silver in them. In the time of Augustus, they had coins which had about 90% silver. By the time we get to the 3rd century, they're proud when their coins contain 5% silver. So they're basically just silver-washed coins. They have a thin veneer of silver, and the rest of it becomes inexpensive metal. But the problem is there's a fixed ratio between bronze coins and the silver coins. The imperial mints made the gold and silver coins. Local mints made bronze coins. And so as a result of this economic crisis, local towns that had been making coins, towns like the city of Abila where I excavate, they gave up making their own coins here in the time of the Severides. These would be the last coins that they would make because it wasn't worth it to them. They're making coins that are supposedly at a fixed ratio with the silver coins, but people didn't want the silver coins, and so they're actually making bronze coins that are worth more than what the silver coins are, and the result is that it's costing the city a great deal of money to make coins. It was good to have coins with your city name on it to advertise yourself and to promote trade, but when the city's going broke doing so, this is a problem. And so this is going to have an impact on economies as people move away from a coined economy to a barter economy where people will trade chicken for flour. One of the problems with not having coins is that long-distance trade is severely affected. It's hard to send resources to purchase valuable things otherwise. Another factor contributing to the economic crisis would be climatic fluctuations. When the weather is bad or the rains come at the wrong time, the crops don't flourish. If there's not enough rain, crops don't flourish. And this is going to have an impact on the society as it's going to drive up prices and lead to shortages at times, shortages which result in people not eating as many calories, and as they don't eat as many calories, they're physically vulnerable, and as they're physically vulnerable, then they get sick, they're weak, they can't fight, or their children don't survive, and so these would be problems that they would face. Beyond economic crises, there are also political crises, as there are foreign invaders. What we'll see is that there will always be a persisting, nagging problem in the East from the Persians. The Sassanids, the Persian dynasty that's in place, continue to press against the Romans, and eventually will even kill emperors that go to fight against them, people like Valerian, who died in the year 260. This will make the Romans weak, and as they're weakened, sometimes subject nations will rebel against them. This would be the case in the eastern frontier, as the Palmyrene queen Zenobia rebelled against them, and emperors would have to go to crush such a rebellion. In the West, there are growing pressures, as we're going to find that people aspire to move across the frontier, to immigrate beyond the limes, within the limes, and there'll be growing pressure that will take place there, and we'll see later how Germanic people, the Franks and the Goths, are going to cause serious problems. There's also something of a social challenge that comes about with religion. Certainly Eastern religions had been making their inroads amongst the Romans, and with the mystery religions and the like. But then also Christianity would emerge on the scene, and traditionalist Romans would sometimes see these religions as being the cause of the problems, as they would make the gods unhappy with them. In times when there's economic troubles, political troubles, there also emerge certain social problems, as we see the breakdown of the rule of law, and a sense of disenfranchisement that can come as people don't feel represented by government. They get to be rather apathetic towards it, and so this will be something of a social problem which will contribute to Rome's problems. So there's a lot of anxiety that emerges in the 3rd century, and people who are anxious respond in different ways. Sometimes they look for somebody to blame. Sometimes they try and figure out ways to resolve the problem. So Rome's response to its anxieties is, first of all, to seek military champions, and this is what led to the rule of all those barracks emperors. Some of their barracks emperors were very effective military leaders, people like Philip the Arab, who ruled from 240 until 249. He ruled during the period of the Millennial Games, where Rome celebrated its 1000th year. Remember, if you go back in their calendar, you can see that they start their year 1 in our year 753 BC. So during Philip's tenure in office, they were able to celebrate 1,000 years of Rome's existence. Another military champion would be Aurelian. But with the coming and going of the various military champions with their armies in Rome, there was an ongoing problem as new armies might come, and there are all these civil wars. In response to this, a conclusion was finally reached by the Emperor Diocletian. He's a military champion, but Diocletian sets forth to change the situation. All the economic troubles are going on, political troubles, and in response, the most strategic thing he does is to make an administrative change in the governance of the Roman Empire. He establishes something called a tetrarchy. That would be a rule by 4 people. Under his tetrarchy, he basically establishes a system of succession. He recognizes that the Roman Empire is divided east and west between Latin-speaking peoples and Greek-speaking peoples, and so over the west, he places one individual to be an Augustus, using the title of the old emperor, and Over the east, he puts an Augustus. Over the west, he also has a Caesar. And over the east, he also has a Caesar. So there's 2 Augusti and 2 Caesars to rule the empire. This is the system of succession that he establishes. And he's going to eventually embrace this, and as he comes to the end of his reign, he's actually going to force his fellow Augustus to retire. And the idea is that then Caesars will step up to become new Augusti, and new Caesars will be chosen in their place. So what he's done is he's actually tried to address the succession problem, and this is going to help to promote peace and stability. Now, he still has huge economic problems, and so he's going to establish an economic program where he's going to mandate fixed prices. He's going to establish price controls. Now, the problem with there's price controls is that oftentimes people don't want to charge those prices because they can actually get more. And so oftentimes there's a vigorous black market that comes with controlled prices. This might have been seen in the last generation in Russia, for example, during the Cold War, when there may be an official price for bread. We'll say bread was 1 ruble a loaf. But the problem was there are only 2 or 3 loaves for sale at that price. And if you want to buy bread, you go to the back door of the bakery where you may pay 2 rubles a loaf, but there's always plenty. They haven't run out. In response to the black market, Diocletian will establish very severe penalties against black marketeers. Another economic challenge was the fact that there are certain positions that people held that made them responsible for things. So, for example, if you were a ruler over a city, you were responsible for the taxes that were raised there. So, basically, you got the tax bill and had to pay it, and then you had to go and raise the taxes from amongst your constituency in town. And the problem was that people didn't want to take certain jobs. And in response to this, Diocletian mandated certain professional restrictions. Sons of people who were cobblers had to become cobblers. People who were soldiers, their sons had to become soldiers. People who were mayors of town, their sons would be raised to be effectively the mayors of town. Diocletian, like some preceding barracks emperors, saw Christianity as something of a undercurrent that destabilized society and certainly brought about changes, and he suspected brought about the opposition of the gods. As a result, he's going to pursue a program of religious persecution of Christians. We're going to talk about that later in a subsequent lecture. The problem of this system of tetrarchy, or as he comes to know it as the dominate, the rulers come to be known as dominus, that would be the equivalent of saying Lord, would be when these tetrarchs don't get along with each other and don't cooperate with each other. This will be a serious problem for the succeeding generation. So the system of tetrarchy starts out with Diocletian, and as he comes to be an old man, he retires, he forces his fellow Augustus to retire, and he goes off to raise cabbages in his old age. But the problem comes very quickly as there's troubles that happen with the next system of succession. With this system of succession, what happens is that Constantius, over in the west, who's a Caesar, is loved by his troops, and when he dies, the troops decide to elect his son, Constantine, as their new emperor. The rulers of the West are at odds with each other, the Augustus and the Caesar, and as a result, there would be another civil war. And Constantine would make his way towards Rome, and as he did so, he's going to come into conflict, of course. So he comes to be elected as a Caesar in the year 306, and by 311 there's going to be conflict. Now, Constantine's an interesting person. We want to consider his role as the emperor at this time period. His mother apparently was a Christian. Her name is Helena. But initially, at least, he seemed to be rather devoted to the god Sol Invictus, the invincible sun. But as he goes to fight in Italy, he comes near Milan to a strategic crossing at Milvian Bridge. And apparently the night before the battle, he had a vision, a dream. And in his vision, he heard a voice and saw a vision of a standard, a labrum, with the words, "In hoc signo vinci," in this sign conquer. What he saw was the symbol of the chi and the rho. These are two Greek letters. The chi looks like an X, and the rho looks like a P to many of us. And these two letters are superimposed, making a monogram. These are the first two letters of the word Christ, and come to be a symbol for Christ in Christian symbolism. Seizing upon this dream, he fought under those standards and was victorious. Subsequently, a proclamation was made at Milan, known as the Edict of Milan, and under this edict, there would be some changes. Christianity would become a regio licita, a legal religion, no longer to be persecuted. And Constantine consolidated his hold in the west as he defeated Maxentius, and Licinius, the ruler of the east, conceded to his rise to power in the west. And so the Edict of Milan is going to be of pivotal importance for Christianity, but what we're going to see is that Constantine is going to embrace Christianity and in some ways use Christianity to advance his purposes. Constantine's legislation does sometimes show his conversion to, at least his embrace of Christianity. He's not baptized until his deathbed, but he's going to embrace Christianity as the favored religion of his empire. And as we look, we're going to find he's going to continue various legislations regarding economics, and he's going to try to come up with a military strategy that's going to help him to be able to respond to challenges more rapidly. He's going to tend to concentrate troops near urban centers and move more towards a more mobile military, where these concentrations of troops would then go to where incursions happened. So there'd be growing emphasis on cavalry to make them more mobile, for example. Not everybody's going to like what he does, and later on, around the year 500, there's a historian, Zosimus, who writes his New History, in which he gives a rather negative account of Constantine and his reforms. You need to understand Zosimus is a pagan, and he doesn't appreciate the changes that Constantine brought. Perhaps reflecting Constantine's Christianity, we find him making some humanitarian laws. Under these laws, branding of slaves on the face, for example, was outlawed. Newborns were no longer to be abandoned if they weren't desired. More clearly supportive of the church would be the fact that church properties were given tax-exempt status like the pagan temples. And the clergy were exempted from having to serve in various municipal roles. Another area of advance would be that there's some calendar changes. In the rule of Constantine here, December the 25th is declared a holiday. Now originally, 25th of December was a day celebrated in association with Sol Invictus, the invincible sun. The 25th of December is the first day that there's a perceptible increase in the length of days after the winter solstice, a few days before. What we're going to find as we move towards the end of the rule of Constantine would be that in the year 321, Sunday would be made a weekly holiday. this reflects the influence of Christianity. Now, as we look at Constantine's coins, what we find is that he embraces the use of the Chi-Rho symbol on his coins, and there is some decline in the use of pagan symbols, but some of those will persist. There's not a house cleaning of all things pagan. There still is a very large pagan community in the Roman Empire. What we'll see, though, is that Constantine will engage in religious matters. He will take the title of Pontifex Maximus of Rome, and as such, he's going to engage in what comes to be known as Caesaropapism, where the Caesar is engaged as a paternalistic figure looking after the church. And this will be seen in the construction of church buildings across the Roman Empire, something that Eusebius in his history certainly lauds. And the result will be that there will be churches not just in Rome, but far away, that will be constructed with the encouragement of the emperor. The emperor is very much concerned about Christianity. In the year 326, he's going to call a meeting of bishops to a place called Nicaea. Amongst the pressing issues that face him at that point in time that seem to be threatening to divide Christianity is, first of all, a question of calendar. When do you celebrate resurrection? This is what's known sometimes by the highfalutin term, the Quartodecimanian controversy, or to translate that more into English, the 14 controversy. When do you celebrate what comes to be known later in European society as Easter, the Paschal celebration? When do you celebrate the resurrection of Jesus? Now, we can certainly celebrate that every day and every week as we remember the Lord's death around the Lord's table. But this group was very concerned about this matter, and some people followed the Jews, and as a result, they celebrated based upon the moon, just as the calendar was established back in the Old Testament, where you have the celebration of Passover celebrated in association with the first full moon following the vernal equinox. So the decision that comes out of this, the resolution, is that the church bishops largely decide that they will begin to celebrate the resurrection of Jesus on the first Sunday after the full moon, after the vernal equinox. So resurrection is always celebrated on a Sunday, and because of the sun and the moon both being at work here, we're going to find that there's a variation from late in March to late in April that this celebration can take place. And so this resolves this controversy. The main issue seemed to be that the Christians wanted to distinguish themselves from the Jews, and as a result wanted to move away from associating their celebration with the Jewish celebration. The second issue was that of the Donatist controversy. The Donatists were some religious rigorists in North Africa who basically asserted that if somebody had capitulated, if they had apostatized, if they turned against the faith in the face of persecution, that any of the religious acts that they had done were not valid. So, for example, if a local bishop or church leader had married somebody or had baptized somebody, then what these people are saying is that marriage didn't really take place. Any children that you have are illegitimate. That if you were baptized, you're not really baptized, so therefore you're not really a Christian. And so the issue here was to resolve in this period after persecution what to do with people who regarded individuals who caved in under pressure to be traitors. And the decision is that one's baptism, for example, is not made invalid by the later apostasy of a person who performed that action. The third and more nagging controversy is going to be a question over the nature of Jesus. This is the Arian controversy. There were some high-profile personalities involved: Arius and Athanasius. These are two individuals who came into conflict, particularly down in Egypt and Alexandria, two religious leaders. The question was having to do with the person of Jesus Christ. The Arians asserted that Jesus was like God. The orthodox position of Athanasius was that Jesus was God. The key test here would be, is Jesus divine? What some people who tried to mediate tried to say was that Jesus was homoousios. That would be Jesus of a similar essence as God. But the orthodox position was that Jesus was homoousios. There's just an iota difference between the two words. But there's a wide difference between Jesus being of similar essence and as being of the same essence as God. The assertion here is that Jesus is fully God and fully man simultaneously. The Arians believed that there was a time when Jesus was not. So he's not co-eternal with the Father and the Spirit. There's a lot of discussion. Clearly, there are problems with the understanding of the idea of the Trinity using Greek logic, and Arius is trying to accommodate Christian theology to the Greeks' logic. The result ultimately would be that Constantine and these bishops would decide to hold to the position that Jesus is fully divine, and Arius would be exiled. But this doesn't make the problem go away. There's a lot of people that are struggling with this question of the nature of Jesus, and this will be something that will divide the church for some time. Another issue that we find is resolved, at least maybe not so much resolved as it's clearly addressed, is the question of epistemology. How do we know about God? Where do we find revelation? Which books really measure up as part of the canon, part of the books of the Bible? Amongst rival theologies had been the Marcionites, who had removed items from scriptures in the years between the apostles and Constantine. On the other hand, there were people who made additions to the scriptures, like the Montanists. They believed they had continuing revelation, and so they added to the scriptures. So on both extremes, there's an issue. What constitutes the authoritative text that we look to? Which books should be a part of that collection? And so what you'll find as you read Eusebius is that there's discussion about this, and they essentially come up with the books that we have in our New Testament and Old Testament today. And there's some books that they valued, but they didn't find as being inspired by God. In the time of Constantine, what we have bishops over individual large cities that particularly rise to prominence. With the coming of Constantine, certainly the bishop of Constantinople gains a certain amount of power because he's close to the emperor. But we have a variety of old cities where the apostles had been, and so there are people that were leaders of the church in Jerusalem who thought that they perhaps had priority, and leaders in the church in Antioch who think that they're particularly significant, and back in Rome. And so there's a number of potential rivals for leadership, but people are looking to urban centers, to the leaders of the church in those areas, and what we'll find is they've moved towards a monarchical episcopacy, where they have a single bishop over those large cities. Now, while we've seen Constantine responding to circumstances in trying to address real problems with the military or with economics, and responding in connection with his faith, there are certainly some problematic activities. in Constantine's family, we find that there's a lot of dysfunction, where he has a son, Crispus, executed, and the Empress Fausta is executed for her disloyalty. Some other things that continue are problematic as the spectacles of the games continue on, where essentially prisoners of war are executed for the entertainment of people, and pagan symbols continue to be retained in various constructions, but there's clearly evidence that Constantine favored the church, and I think was well-intentioned towards the church. But what we're going to find is that there's some serious things that emerge as a result of blending of things from the Roman political world and religious experience into the church. Constantine succeeded in unifying the empire under himself as he fought a war with Licinius. But when it comes to his transition in power, he's going to have 3 sons who remain to succeed him. And so we'll move back to a dynastic form of succession. His 3 sons are Constantius, Constans, and Constantine II. Now, as his sons come to take power upon their father's death, their father's actually baptized on his deathbed. Apparently he wanted to have forgiveness for his sins, and didn't understand how Christians continue to be covered by the blood of Christ. And so, as emperor who would be decreeing death warrants, he waited till his deathbed to be baptized. But his sons have learned power politics better than they've learned the faith. Each one of them is going to essentially rule over a third of the empire. They're supposed to cooperate together. But Constantius was a semi-Arian. He believed that Jesus was similar to God. Constans was Orthodox. He believes that Jesus is God. And so this is going to lead to a division between these brothers over empire. So the empire will be divided, and there will be disputes between the East and the West. This terribly dysfunctional family kills off parts of its own, and the result is kind of interesting, as these 2 brothers rule for a fairly long time. When the brother Constans dies, this leaves Constantius in power for 11 years as he finishes out his reign, and he's going to allow Arians who had been imprisoned to be freed, and this will cause further divisions around the Roman Empire. But as he dies, he doesn't have an heir, and so as a result, Julian, a family member, will come to be the next ruler, and he's only going to rule for 3 years. Julian had seen his father murdered, and had lived in exile for a number of years. He had been given an Athenian education and rejected Christianity of other members of his family, and instead embraced paganism, and would try to revive paganism during his rule. And so as a result, he's known by the epithet Julian the Apostate. He's the person who's turned his back on the faith. Now, he will have military successes in the West, in Gaul, but eventually he's going to die as a result of conflict with the Persians in the East. During his reign, he will retract some of the privileges that Constantine had given to Christians. He will publish a number of anti-Christian polemics. One of these has the interesting title, Misopogon. If you find the word miso in an English word, oftentimes it has to do with a hater. So you might have a misanthrope, would be a person who hates people. A misogynist would be a man who hates women. But the misopogon, that translates as the beard haters. Philosophers wore beards, and Christians rejected beards typically and were clean-shaven. And so this is his first polemic. His next work is entitled Against the Galileans. In this, he's going to criticize the Christianity of the 4th century and try to revive paganism. His paganizing campaign isn't terribly successful. First of all, he tries to bring about temple refurbishment. The problem is that a lot of temples have been taken over by churches and repurposed. But there's not a lot of money to spend on rebuilding or constructing temples. Perhaps he saw some political advantage in pursuing this campaign. But what he did recognize is that Christianity was superior in various ways. And so one of the things that he did was try to promote pagan morality, that people would love each other and care for each other. In this regard, he was never successful. In trying to promote trouble for the church, he would also promote Judaism and encourage the Jews to consider reconstructions in Jerusalem. He would certainly promote division within the church by allowing various bishops who'd been sent into exile because of their heresies to return, and so as a result we have divergent teaching going on in some of the urban centers. Finally, however, he died fighting against the Sassanid Persians, and according to Theodoret in his church history, his dying words were, "Galilean, you have conquered." With the death of Julian, we once again have issues over who's going to be the emperor, and the individuals that will come to be emperors that succeed him will be Valens and Valentinian, co-emperors. They'll continue to maintain a unified empire, but it's ruled east and west. These two individuals had doctrinal differences in regard to their Christology. But the Roman Empire was vulnerable and is facing growing pressure from Germanic migrations, particularly the Western Goths. We know them as the Visigoths. In the year 378, at the Battle of Adrianople, the Visigoths defeat the Roman army. And this is going to be a devastating development. Valentinian had died in 375, and Valens was ruling over the whole empire. And what apparently happened was that the Visigoths, who'd lived on the frontiers of the Roman Empire, had been allowed to come within the Roman Empire, to come past the limes, the frontiers. But as they did so, they found themselves not treated in a Christian fashion, as they were starving to death in the midst of a bad winter. They were offered dog meat to eat, and they didn't consider that to be a worthy sort of food. And as a result, they took offense and would go on something of an attack. For a long time, they'd been serving the Romans as auxiliaries, helping to defend the frontier. But now, within the frontier, they turn against the Romans and drive towards Constantinople and defeat the forces at Adrianople. Now, the Visigoths will continue to be an issue as they're going to press on across the Roman Empire, and eventually we're going to find that the Visigoths are going to settle down in the Iberian Peninsula in what we know as Spain. And they're going to change some things there. The next emperor who comes to power in the year 379 is Theodosius. He's going to rule up until 395. He's a great military figure who reunifies the empire. He's a singular ruler. He will defend Britain as it's coming to be subject to invasions. He will certainly pacify the Goths on the northern European frontier. In his religious policy, he's going to be responsible for promoting Christianity, to promote the orthodoxy, the religious position of the council at Nicaea, as they have another council in the year 381 at Constantinople. He's going to make Christianity effectively the only legal religion within the Roman Empire. This means that he prohibited pagan sacrifices, closed temples, punished heretics, people within Christianity who had divergent ideas. He would terminate the Olympic Games, the spectacles that took place in cities like Rome and the Colosseum. Now, there's an interesting story that's told about how some of this comes about, particularly as a monk went to Rome, a monk by the name of Telemachus, and when he saw what was going on in the arena, he apparently jumped down into the arena, calling upon the crowd to stop this travesty, and the crowd instead called for his death, and he died as a result of standing against this inhumanity. But this gets the emperor's attention, and he's going to bring about an end to these blood sports that had so entertained the Romans for a long time. Theodosius also shows himself to be subject to religious authority. In the town of Thessalonica, there had been something of uprising, and in response, he had ordered a massacre. In response, Ambrose, a bishop, excommunicated him, basically said he can't participate in the Lord's Supper, and he's cut off from the blessings of the church, and of course that would mean that you're going to hell. And so, in response, he's going to seek forgiveness from the church, and this shows his submission to the church authorities. This is going to be an interesting and ongoing challenge, the relationship between the church and the state. Theodosius ruled until the year 395, and he was the last significant ruler of both the East and the West. He made peace with the Visigoths as they had fought at Adrianople, and the Visigoths moved westward, and as they moved towards the west, they came into conflict then subsequently with Theodosius' successors, and the Visigoths ended up being led by a man by the name of Alaric, who moved down the Italian peninsula in the year 410, captured the city of Rome, and the Visigoths sacked Rome. This is the first time that Rome has been sacked since the time of the Celts, back around 300 BC, so for 700 years. But this was a surprise to them, and something that's going to cause alarm, and we're going to find a number of church writers are going to write about this and think about the changes that are taking place when this Roman political power that's been around for so long is shown to be weak and vulnerable, and their capital city is able to be attacked. So Alaric and the Visigoths sack Rome, they carry away treasures, and they're going to eventually settle in what we know today as Spain in the Iberian Peninsula. The Visigoths had been pushed forward by the Huns, an Asiatic group who were migratory in nature. They're led by Attila. The Huns will drive into Roman territory. And another people group that will be pushed along will be the Vandals. The Vandals, unlike the Visigoths who had converted to Arian Christianity, are pagans who disdained Roman urban culture. And what we're going to find is that as the Visigoths come, they're going to drive down into Spain and fight with the Visigoths, but then move on to North Africa, and from North Africa they'll invade from the south upwards into Rome in the year 455. And as they invade Rome, they cause all kinds of destruction, and it's from their wanton destruction that we get the idea of vandalism. So the Vandals sack Rome. So Rome's here within one generation attacked yet again. The German-speaking peoples will have others that will be moving, and amongst them will be the Ostrogoths and the Franks. The Franks are going to be a people group who come to occupy what we know today as France. They're going to cross the Rhine frontier when the river freezes over. This is the indication of something that's going on that's new. It has to be cold for a long duration for moving water like the Rhine River to freeze over, and once it freezes over, then the Roman frontier defenses can't respond to all the many places where people can cross. When you have this big river flowing, they can control the bridges and crossing points, and yet when people can cross anywhere they choose, then they don't have the capacity to withhold that kind of insurgence. And so the Franks are going to pour into the western part of the Roman Empire. The Ostrogoths will actually drive all the way down into Rome, and there in Rome they will depose Romulus Augustulus in the year 476, the last Roman emperor, and they'll send his crown to Byzantium, to Constantinople, the eastern capital of the Roman Empire, basically saying, we don't need it, you can have it back. But while the Ostrogoths capture this area, they, like these other invaders, have been very much influenced by Roman society. So we've looked at these various invaders that come into Rome, and people have long tried to explain why Rome fell. This is actually something that was discussed by Zosimus, a pagan historian around the year 500, writing from Constantinople. He basically blamed the fall of Rome upon Christians. And later on, we move to the 17th century, we'll find that Edward Gibbon, in his famous 6-volume work, The Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire, will basically look to blame Christians also. Now, Zosimus thought that militarily that Constantine had made some mistakes, and thought that the gods were against Rome because of permitting Christians to exist and to thrive. Edward Gibbon would think that Christians are to blame because their theology led to a certain softness and to a preoccupation, where he's going to say that Christians are preoccupied on heaven and thinking about spiritual matters rather than physical concerns and day-by-day concerns, that the best and brightest, instead of being focused on the problems of this world, were busy contemplating spiritual matters and living in isolation in monks' cells and the like, instead of applying themselves to the situation. So the first explanations for the fall of Rome were that there were unhappy gods whose temples and rites were ignored by Christians. Now, that's what Zosimus had said. On the other side, early Christians would say that the fall of Rome was God's judgment on persistent paganism. Basically, the Christians had allowed paganism to continue, and so therefore this was judgment upon the Christians for allowing pagans to continue to practice their religions. There's all kinds of theories that are out there. Gibbon, his explanation is that Christians' belief and practice weakened Rome because they're busy thinking about heavenly things rather than earthly things, and because of their love ethic, that there was a decline in recruitment for the armies. Instead of using Roman might and force, now Christians are trying to use love and grace. These theories are not sufficient. God does work in time to accomplish his purposes, and Rome certainly served a role in the purposes that God had established. But as we look to find other theories, and as people look at our time and wonder about social change and anxieties in our time, sometimes they look to Rome and draw some comparisons. Some people, as they look at the Romans, say, well, it was because of morality that Rome fell. This moral theory asserts that immorality consumes the Romans, who didn't see their demise approaching because they're busy having orgies and the like. Now, my assessment of this is that morality was increasingly being shaped by a Christian population. As we had said, the spectacles had been terminated. Some aspects of immorality had in fact been condemned by law. And then there's, of course, the other observation that Roman immorality had been rampant when the empire was growing dramatically and was successful and prosperous. So morality doesn't necessarily have all the answers to explaining why things fell apart here. Others would assert that there was a leadership failure on the part of Rome, in that Rome failed to enfranchise its citizens and was not democratic enough. My assessment again would be that it wasn't terribly democratic when it grew, and while leadership is terribly important, Rome had actually survived many, many bad leaders, terrible leaders at times. So leadership issues are not the complete answer either. Some others look to sociology, and some people say, well, there is cultural dilution. There's a breakdown of Roman identity. People weren't fighting for Rome vigorously because they didn't know that being Romans worth fighting for. Amongst sociological theories, other people, particularly amongst the Marxists, they look towards trying to explain this in terms of class struggle. That Rome was weak because of slavery. Others would say, well, Rome had gotten fat and sassy, and what they were suffering was affluenza. There's a apathy that existed because they had gotten comfortable instead of fighting as they had originally. Tied with sociological theories, we've also find some racist theories. This was particularly exhibited in economic historian Tinny Frank in his Economic History of Rome. It's got some great things to say for it, but in his work, he basically blamed Rome's fall on miscegenation. That would be intermarriage, or another term that might be used would be mongrelization of the Romans. Basically, the assertion that the Romans' blood was polluted by intermarriage. Now, even on as we look beyond people, if you look at crossbreeding in animals, what you find is that by crossbreeding, there's often a crossbreed vigor that emerges. There's certain advantages that come through crossbreeding. And as we look at inbreeding, perhaps you might look at show dogs, what you find is that certain breeds develop certain problems because the gene pool is limited. This was popular clearly within Nazi Germany and is not a widely spread explanation today. Another theory would be that of the area of medicine, that there were medical problems. Certainly disease had promoted a declining population. Some people look to find sources of some of their problems, and they assert that it was lead poisoning that was to blame. Certainly the Romans, in their quest for silver, produced a great deal of lead, and some of that lead was used to make vessels that they used to eat off of, like pewter, a mixture of tin and lead. It was a cheap and durable material. They also had lead pipes through which their water flowed. They had pewter vessels that they sometimes used to cook in, and so they no doubt did consume a great deal of lead. But this didn't make everybody insane and unable to think. In fact, the population was greater at the time of Rome's fall than it was in the time of Augustus. So populations continued to grow throughout this time period. There certainly have been things that have impeded that growth as plagues have struck and as there have been wars and the like. But this isn't sufficient explanation all by itself either. Another set of theories that people look to explain the fall of Rome is environmental theory. Clearly, there was climatic fluctuation. Some people try to say that, the Romans are to blame for soil exhaustion, but what we'll find is that subsequent people can still grow crops on the soils that they had tilled at earlier times. Climatic fluctuations are a hardship. Clearly, there was changes as the Rhine River was able to freeze over in the year 406. In conjunction with that, we'll find that there's pressure on in the island of Britain, where people from up in the highlands will push towards the south to where it's warmer. The Germanic peoples in the north will push towards the south where they can grow more crops and have more food to feed their families. And so I think that clearly climate does play a role, but it's not the complete answer all by itself. There's some who look towards economics. They say, there's an imbalance of trade that happens with the Orient, with the East. Certainly the Romans bought all kinds of luxury goods from the East. They liked to smell swell, and they bought expensive perfumes from the East. And a lot of their treasure then left their empire to buy expensive trade items like this. But that had been going on for a very, very long time. And so it too doesn't provide all the explanations. Other people look towards military theories to see, did Rome have inferior generals and use old, outdated strategies that were ineffective in face of new challenges? Was it because they were dependent upon mercenary armies? As I assess all these theories, I would see these theories often reflect the philosophical or topical interests of the person doing the analysis. Individual theories here are often overly simplistic. The barbarian invasions were clearly final blows delivered to an empire that had weakened as a result of long-term problems and internal flaws. Having served divine purposes, the Roman Empire was no longer sustained by God, and it would break apart as it was prophesied. But a new kingdom emerged with the Roman Empire and grew throughout the late Roman Empire, a kingdom that continues to exist and will exist forever in the Church. The Church will be the subject of our discussion as we look at the Christian contributions to Western civilization in our next series of lectures. Thank you very much.